Francis, how are you today?
I'm fine.
Could you tell us a little bit of what we're about to see when we enter this castle?
Yeah, this castle is a place of door of no return. But I can say today there's a door of return.
So at one time, this was called the door of no return because the slaves were taken through this door. Mm-hmm. Now, are we bringing slaves back through this door and calling it the door of return?
Yeah, today there is a door of return because our brothers and sisters are finding their way and they are coming back. That's why we are doing PANAFEST, to rearrange the African family so that they can see and come back to their home.
Thank you, Francis, for this information. If you're just joining us, you are watching Caribbean Body Talk, where the vision gets clearer every time. And Black history and culture are part of our vision.
Yes. Cape Coast Castle was built by the British. The British actually started building this castle in 1664. And they built it gradually. So historians doesn't have the exact date as the whole fortification was built today. They have it that due to successive series of alterations and additions that produced present-day Cape Coast Castle from the 17th century through the 18th century and early 19th century that produced the British fortification, which is serving as World Monument Heritage by UNESCO.
So let the tour begin.
As the whole fortification was built, they have it that due to successive series of alterations and additions that produced this present-day Cape Coast Castle from the 17th century to the 18th century and early 19th century that produced the present-day Cape Coast Castle. And I've been told by your guide that the Palaver Hall is open. So we will go to the Palaver Hall and start the tour. Because it was the Palaver Hall that the business, that is the transatlantic business transactions, was handled before even the captives were brought into their dungeons, where the merchants meet to bargain and discuss their prices and so on. So we shall move to the Palaver Hall of Cape Coast Castle. It later served as a conference room and other significance in history for Ghana. So as we go to the Palaver Hall, I'll tell you everything over there. Let's go. This room is the Palaver Hall of Cape Coast Castle. It was here that the business transactions between the Europeans and the Africans actually took place. That is between the British and the African merchant counterpart. It was at this room that they bargained for their prices over the mineral resources and also slaves. The transatlantic trade was the Europeans did imported in here finished goods from Europe like sugar, cloth, alcoholic beverages, gunpowder, finished iron products like slave chains and so on from Europe to the African merchant here in exchange of mineral resources like gold, ivory, beads, pepper, and other resources. But later they gradually realized that the mineral resources was diminishing. That was when they totally replaced it with the slave trade. So it was at this room that they bargained for their prices and so on. And after that, the same room served for another purpose. That is, it served as a judicial system law of court, where the second British governor here, Governor George McLean, used as court. He introduced the judiciary system in Ghana. Before that, this dispute and conflict and so on was settled by the chiefs in the localities. But he introduced the European court system in the coastal area. And it was at this room that first he used as his court room, where he settled disputes and so on. This room also served for a very important, significant history in the history of Ghana. That That is a very important bond. That is the bond of 1844, which legally ushered Ghana to British colonial rule. The bond of 1844 was signed by Commander Hill and also the Southern State Chiefs, which allowed the British to extend their protectorate along all the coastal areas. Then in 1902, they conquered the only strongest empire in Ghana, that is the Ashanti Empire, for the British to extend their protectorate to the northern sector till our independence in 1957. That was when we did attain the name Ghana. Before then, here was named by the Portuguese, the first Europeans, as Gold Coast, due to the abundance of gold and riches they got from the coastal areas here. By the end of the tour in Cape Coast Castle, we realized all these activities that I've talked about went through in the structure of this castle.
Thank you. And the tour continues.
Yes. Over there, you can see all those old buildings scattered over there. That is the old city of Cape Coast. That's where the people were settling with the Europeans also here whilst they traded with them. So this was where the people had their products like gold and other mineral resources, ivory, beads, pepper, for the Europeans here to exchange their Europeans products also from the castles. But they did not trade it with the Europeans alone. They also did trade it with their African counterparts. Even the people over there bought the European imported goods like the sugar, cloth, alcoholic beverages, the irons, and so on, and sold some to those from the interior part. So they did serve as the middlemen in the trade, in the transatlantic trading activities. So this is the old site of Cape Coast before the other new buildings that were recently built.
Our tour guide, Ms. Frederica Rule, continues with the tour of Cape Coast Castle.
Yes. Over there, up the hill, you can see a very small white fort there. That is Fort William, built by the British in 19th century. That is in 1820. Due to the trade activities between the Europeans and the Africans and the benefit that the Europeans were getting, there was a lot of competition between the Europeans. So all the European nations actually fortified their forts and castles here and also built strategic buildings to aid them in their trade. The British built Fort William in 1820 for defense reasons for this castle. Fort William did contain soldiers and officers. If you are in Fort William, you can see almost inland Cape Coast and also above the sea. So when they see any other European ship coming near the castle, they give the soldiers in the castle signal. Or when they hear any insurrection among the people, they also give the castle official signal for them to be alert to wait for them. So that is Fort William, built by the British in 19th century, 1820. And down here, that is presently serving as the quarters for the artisans. That was where the British soldiers were staying, the barracks for the British soldiers. The British garrison were occupying the floor here, all the rooms down here. So they were later moved from Cape Coast to Accra, Christianbul Castle. Then they used those barracks to be prison yard in Cape Coast Castle. But presently, the artisans of Cape Coast are occupying that area. So this was just the barracks for the British garrison. This small room here served as their communications room, communicating with Fort William and the castle. If you are in this very small window, you can see Fort William above the hill. So always there will be a soldier in this communication room looking at Fort William through the small window. So if the Fort William soldiers detect any negative thing against the castle, they give the soldier here a signal. So I do understand that in those days, because the communication system was not very much effective like today, in the evening they use fire as a signal to the soldier here. In the afternoon, they did use mirror and sun for the soldier here. In the morning, they poured water for the soldier here to know that there is something wrong coming near the castle, for them to also alert the British garrison down there, for them to be ready on the cannons. governors in Cape Coast Castle. You can see a lot of windows around, which aided them to very highly ventilated halls. But presently, the governor's residence is under renovation. This whole area did serve as the sitting hall for the British governors. They had windows to aid them to very highly ventilated halls, which is unlike the dungeons, which also house people in this castle. Over there is the governor's bedroom. This part was their sitting hall. There also was the reception for the governor. To meet the governor must meet him at the reception here. If the native chiefs want to present their protest for the governor, they have to meet him here. Or any European envoy that want to meet the British governor here, this area serves as the reception for all those people who want to meet the governor. These are some of the remains of the British cannons and cannonballs which were imported from Europe to defend this castle. As I told you, due to the competition between the Europeans all fortified their forts and castles in the coastal area so that no any other European ship can attack them, and also the native people could not attack them and capture it away from them. In 1700s, the British to subdue the people against insurrection, and also to combat any other Europeans attacking the British here from land. So these are the remains of the British cannons and balls which were imported in to defend Cape Coast Castle. Slave dungeons in the castle, and in fact these are the most terrible sights that you can find in the whole castle. That is the dungeons. In the transatlantic slave trade, they held that these dungeons in the castle actually witnessed. Historians doesn't have the exact word to describe the whole scenario. By the end of the tour through the dungeons, you realize what I'm talking about. Words cannot describe what really went on in the dungeons. And as I told you, the trade lasted in the soil of Africa for 300 years, between from 1400 to the 1800s. And this is the most terrible sight, the male slave dungeon. We shall now enter it to see the conditions. The male captives were intentionally kept underground there for security reasons, so that the British garrison could contain them over there. So let us all now move slowly into the male dungeon to see the conditions over there. The male slave dungeon of Cape Coast Castle. This whole dungeon that we are in now was actually built with the intention to contain 500 to 600 male captives. But in actual fact, when the slave trade got to its peak, the whole dungeon did contain thousands of male captives at a time. As many male captives that they got, they brought them in here shackled to await their ships for shipment. And actually, this dungeon did contain thousands of male later on because, as I told you, the first Europeans were the Portuguese to the coast here to trade with the people. And the Portuguese did monopolize the trading activities for a very long time, till the other European powers also started rushing in to trade. That is mainly the British, the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedish, and so on. So they broke the Portuguese monopoly from then, and it became known to the Europeans as the veritable gold rush in Africa. They did rush here for the mineral resources, gold, ivory, beads, and other resources. But later, because the Europeans became many here trading with the people, they realized that they were not getting the mineral resources in abundance like they were getting initially. So they realized gradually the minerals was diminishing. They then totally replaced it with the slave trade in order to build the new West Indies empires. The Portuguese entered agreement with the Spanish where they sold most of the captives to them. The British also, who were in this castle, exported most of their captives to the Americas, especially the North Caribbean, certain parts of Europe like Liverpool and so on. That was when the whole dungeon that we are in did contain thousands of male captives at a time. And due to the inhuman conditions under which those captives who were left here were meted to, some of them actually revolted here for their rights. They were regarded to be notorious captives, separated here from the others, beaten well and shackled in here with iron chains and thick ropes. Yes, this is where the notorious captives, as they were regarded, were shackled with the thick ropes and iron chains, separated from the others in order not to form one huge force to fight for their rights. There were no electricity in the dungeons like the way we are seeing today. Those small holes up there, they served as their source of ventilation and also for light. So that small holes there can be found in all the dungeons in this castle. It did serve as their source of ventilation and for light to the dungeons. This very gutter, very small gutter curved on the ground through the dungeon, also they served as their sewage system for urination, defecation, all at the same time. And meanwhile, these dungeons were not cleaned for the captives. So some of the captives died here out of diseases like cholera, malaria, and many other contagious diseases like sleeping sickness and so on.
What kind of position were they in? Were they in a lying position, standing? I mean, how were they kept in here?
Actually, they were sitting on the floor here. That was why, due to the overcrowding, some of the captives actually fought among themselves for space in the dungeons here. So if you were lucky and the person beside you died, then you push it away to get a little space for yourself. So this was the conditions. They were sitting on the ground, on the floor here, for them to await their ship for shipment. There was no way that they could lie due to the overcrowding in the dungeons here. And also because there were many of them stuck in the dungeons, the food that was provided for them was not enough for all of them and didn't get to all the captives in the dungeons. Some of the captives actually died there out of starvation. Because they were many, they gave them something to only sustain them to await the ships to convey them to their new world. So some of them died there out of starvation. And due to the kind of sources of captives that the Europeans here got, a lot of the captives were not from the coast. Though some were from the coast, many of them were from the interior part, as far as the northern part and other neighboring African countries. Some of these holes have been sealed due to later on addition to the structure of this castle.
I know before in the other room you mentioned communication.
Yes.
Because there were so many different languages being spoken, was that one of the reasons why the slaves could not communicate with one another and help each other?
Yes, that is one of the main reasons why they could not communicate well in the dungeons here. As I told you, the sources of captives were many, and the captives were captured from different areas. The African merchants were many who traded with the Europeans here. They were from as far as the northern and other neighboring African countries. Even in Ghana, we have a lot of languages. The language of the people of the southern sector is different from those of the northern sector. For instance, we can't understand ourselves still in our language barrier. Language is still a barrier between us. So when they were captured from different places, brought together here, they could not communicate to understand themselves. Very different languages, so they could not communicate. So communication was a barrier. So the revolt in the dungeons here was actually individual affair. If you get tired with the condition, then you struggle for your right. They could not all at a time come together, like we agree upon this action to take and so on.
And the tour continues.
Please. Before the arrival of the Europeans to the coastal area here, the Africans who were already here did have their own traditional setup. They did have their culture, religion, and many other practices. They believed that this castle was built upon a deep, massive rock here. Originally, that rock did contain a deity or a lesser god called Linet-Akins-Harley, which constitute part of African traditional religion hierarchy. The Africans also believe in God, that is supreme being, but the Europeans brought Christianity. So before the arrival of the Europeans, they didn't know anything about Christianity. So they also worshiped the God or supreme being through these deities. They prayed through them, poured libation through them. So these deities are a means to an end, but not an end in themselves in the African traditional religion. They are mainly residing in rocks, trees, rivers, and so on. Linet-Akins-Harley, which was believed to be here, was existent in rock, and because the British did not know anything, they built the castle upon it. So this shrine was later built by the traditional council after the abolition of the slave trade and to the end of the colonial rule in this castle. So this is the shrine called Linet-Akins-Harley, and that is the priests. But when the slave trade was going on in Cape Coast Castle, and when the Europeans were occupying this castle, this shrine was not existing here. And this whole place behind the shrine was not sealed. The male captives were brought in their dungeon from the courtyard. But if the slave ships arrive and they are going to be exported to their new world, they don't drive them through the courtyard again to the shores of the beach. They were driven through an underground tunnel here. That is a very dark passage underground. They walk through it a little distance. They meet their female counterpart down there. Then they drive them through the last exit in Cape Coast Castle. That is the gate of no return. They drive them through it, take them by a smaller boat at the shores of the beach before the big transatlantic ships on the sea for their voyages. This sealed area and other places in the tunnel here was sealed in 1822 by Sir Charles McCarthy. Cape Coast Castle was under the British merchant.
Trade, the Atlantic Ocean between these three continents. Is it not the reason why it was named transatlantic?
Yes, that's also I'm saying that it was named transatlantic trade because it was between the Europeans and the Africans. And a point of correction, it was not only the British. The Portuguese were even the first before the Dutch, the Danes, and the British, and so on. So it was not only the British who were trading with the Africans. It was a lot of the European nations who were trading with the Africans here. And a lot even came. But due to the competition, some they could not stay. Some went and left the powers, like the Dutch, the Danes, the British, the Portuguese, and so on. It was transatlantic trade because it was between the Europeans and the Africans trading on the transatlantic ocean. But there was already one, that is the trans-Saharan trade. And these are the two differences between the trans-Saharan and the transatlantic. It was named transatlantic because it was between the Europeans and the Africans, and they were trading from Africa on the sea to Europe. Large area here did serve to them as their courtyard, but later the British used the courtyard here as the graveyard. They did bury a lot of others here, but they didn't keep records of all those that were buried here. So later they could not recognize those that were buried here, with the exception of the 4 graves here. All the 3 graves over there belong to the British. This is the only African grave that they could recognize in this courtyard. And this grave belonged to the late Reverend Philip Kweku. He was the first Ghanaian that was trained as Anglican priest in the coastal area. As I told you, the first European to trade with the people were the Portuguese. They actually came here to trade with 3 main purposes. One was to trade with the people, to spread missionary activities, and also to find a new short route to India, where they were already trading with the people. So all the other Europeans that followed the Portuguese here did the same thing. They traded with the people and they spread missionary activities. And as I said, this castle was built by the British, and Britain's denomination is Anglican. So the first Anglican church to be built in Ghana is what can be found up the mill dungeon. That is the small room up there. That was the first Anglican church. And this grave here belonged to the first Ghanaian who was trained as Anglican priest in the coastal area. He was trained as a clergyman in Britain, and they served as a clergyman and a schoolmaster to the Negroes here. He did die here in 1860. 16 at the age of 75. But because of his contribution to education in the coastal area, we still have some missionary schools named after him, Philip Kweku School. So Philip Kweku, the Reverend Philip Kweku. So this grave belonged to the late Reverend Philip Kweku in the coastal area. This is the only African grave they could recognize on this courtyard. It belonged to one of the British soldiers. His name was C.B. Whitehead. He was stationed at this castle as a guard, but he died here in 1812 at the age of 38, a British soldier called C.B. Whitehead. And the grave here, the mother grave, belonged to the wife of
And the
Governor
tour
McLean.
continues.
Her name was Letitia Elizabeth London. She was a Chelsea-born poet and a novelist who got married to Governor McLean, but she died barely 2 months after her